Hi, Dr. Robert Selig, and welcome back to part three. Now, in part three, I want to give you some meat and potatoes on how to use the 12 tissue salts, whether you're just looking to improve your own health, whether you're just a mineral enthusiast and you want to improve your understanding of mineral balancing using the tissue salts, or you're a mineral practitioner and you see a lot of things propping up when people are on a mineral balancing program, and how do you help them with the skin flare up, with an acute infection, with old chronic infection? By learning these 12 salts, now we have another tool in our toolbox to help us. And I find that these 12 tissue salts are indispensable. In fact, they are obligatory in my practice. I couldn't practice mineral balancing without the 12 tissue salts. I couldn't practice homeopathy without the use of the 12 tissue salts. So I find them a foundational tool. And when we incorporate our knowledge of these 12 tissue salts, we can really exalt our health and our practice to a much better place. So Dr. Schuessler was a brilliant German physician, around the mid 1800s approximately. And he came on the scene probably about 30, 40 years after Dr. Samuel Hahnemann. Now, he didn't want to study the 2,000 homeopathic remedies at that time. He wanted to simplify homeopathy. And that's really where his true genius lied. Even though this man could read Sanskrit, spoke fluent Greek, Latin, English, Italian, French, this man was a true genius. So understanding his understanding of the other languages gave him the upper hand, because he was able to interpret medical literature from what was, the medical science of the day, to understanding Sanskrit, the ancient medical literature of old. So to me, his genius was the simplification of homeopathy using the tissue salts. So what he did was he suggested that the medicinal component of any homeopathic remedy is in fact made up of one of the 12 mineral salts. For example, pulsatilla, which I prescribe all the time. It's a very common remedy that I utilize. When you see, the capricious child, 1 minute they want chocolate cake, the next minute they want ice cream, 1 minute they're screaming, and the next minute they're in a good mood. The very capricious nature of it, better from open, fresh air, better with hugs, better with, the tears of Venus when they're crying, and, you console them and they do well with hugging and just being there to hear their story and to give them comfort. So the pulsatilla energy is a great homeopathic remedy. But what he did was he wanted to understand, what is it that makes this pulsatilla flower such an important homeopathic remedy? And he broke it down into its component, and it's basically made up of silica and potassium sulfate, two great cell salts. So he didn't want to have to study, again, those 2,000 plus remedies. If he could just master these 12 salts, then he had an in, and he could prescribe these tissue salts with real accuracy, with real success, with real of an understanding of these mineral salts. So when he was looking at the ash content of a corpse, so basically your birth weight is going to be your ash weight. And so that ash weight, through the cremation process with the fire, you're going to see the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen be released as a gas. And that's what, 97, 98% of what you're made up of. But what's left in the ash is primarily the 12 tissue salts. And he theorized that because he was under the influence of Dr. Rudolf Virchow, who is the father of modern day pathology. And Dr. Virchow was always looking at when the cell metabolism deteriorates, that's when we go into symptoms in disease. And so that cell metabolism, whether we're talking, the cell membrane starting to break down, or the mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, or the components in the cytoplasm, the fluid component starts to become toxic, and then the cell becomes deficient in one of the 12 salts. That's where he said, well, we can come in with these tissue salts to restore the health of the cell. And so he knew that in the ash content, basically, we're mostly made up of the 12 tissue salts. And so we know there's other things in there that you can find the trace elements. You can even find, the toxic elements, arsenic, lead, cadmium, mercury. You can also find radioactive elements in the ash. And, over time, those radioactive elements will transmute to lead or iron or potassium. And so knowing what's in the ash content, remember that ash content, those minerals last forever. That's why we name the great cycles of time after them, the Iron Age, the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Bronze Age, because these metals last a very long, long time. And even through the crematory process, they're still there in the ash. And this is why the alchemists always understood how to utilize the ash in their preparation of making alchemical, remedies. So the Schuessler 12 salts, to me, are absolutely indispensable part of what I do. And we can use these cell salts by gaining a better understanding of these 12 salts, which we're going to be looking at. So first, how are these tissue salts made? So first we start with the highest grade mineral, and then that mineral is going to be grounded, pulverized in pestle and mortar into a fine powder dust for a minimum of 200 hours. Now, once we create that powder dust of the mineral, that will be hermetically sealed, and then they'll take one part out of that and add that to 10 parts, either a lactose powder or a sucrose powder, pestle and mortar that until you get a 1x potency. That 1x potency will then take one part out of that and we'll add it to 10 parts sucrose, 10 parts lactose, pestle and mortar that, and that will give us a 2x. Then they'll take one part out of that 2x and add that to either the 10 parts sucrose or the 10 parts lactose powder and pestle and mortar that to give us a 3x, so forth and so on till we get to a 6x. Now we can go into a 30x potency, a 200x potency. We can go into the C potencies, which is a 100 decimal, a 30C, a 6C, a 30C, a 200C. We can get into the 1Ms, the 10Ms, the 50Ms, and the L and M potencies. But the cell salts are really, to me, they are still beyond Avogadro's number, and they're going to give you the closest to a mineral without being it so small that it's not recognized, but we know that the higher the potency, the stronger the medicine. So in cell salt theory, we're using the biochemical aspect so we can get these small diluted minerals into the cell, because basically a cell salt is going to give you about 1 part per million. So that's why it's considered a homeopathic remedy, because it's beyond Avogadro's number. But in homeopathy, the lower, the weaker. And so the higher the potency, when we get into, the 30X, the 200C, the 1Ms, the 10Ms, those are the stronger, and that's going to be working more on an energetic psychological level, where the 6X potency is going to be working the biochemical. And I love the 6x potency because the 6 is, I love using astrology, and we are carbon based, 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and that is the 666. That's why I love these 6x potencies, because it's something that we can work with that is safe and effective, whether it's for infants, whether it's for young children, whether it's for the seniors. So anyone can take a homeopathic cell salt 6x potency, and it's safe and gentle and works beautifully. So this is how the cell salts are made, and they can be really used for any part of the population. So we know infants can't really swallow things, and it's hard to put them on the minerals, and they're going to be very sensitive to taste and texture and swallowing, and seniors are going to have the same stumbling blocks when it comes to swallowing. But the cell salts, we can easily get them right under the tongue, and they dissolve. So that's the beauty of these cell salts. Now, when we look at the 12 salts, we're going to be using 3 sodiums, 3 potassiums, 3 calciums, 1 magnesium, 1 iron, and 1 silica, and that will give us the 12 salts. So the sodium is going to be, we take the cations are on the left, the sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium are your cations. And so sodium will be bound to a phosphate. So we'll have sodium phosphate, or we'll have a sodium sulfate, or we'll have our table salt, sodium chloride. Those are the 3 sodiums. The natrums, the Natrum Muriaticums, the Natrum Sulphates, or the Natrum Phosphates. We'll also have the potassium family, the 3 potassium. Potassium is Kali. Kali is the destroyer. It's the fire element, but potassium is the potash. So we could have potassium phosphate, potassium sulfate, potassium chloride, or Kali phos, Kali sulf, Kali muriaticum. Then we also have the calcium phosphate, the calcium sulfate, the calcium fluoride. So the fluoride, calcium fluoride, is naturally found in nature. What's not naturally found in nature is sodium fluoride. It's the sodium fluoride that the titans of industry are dumping their metabolic waste product back into your water, back into your toothpaste, and it's a poison. Fluoride is the most reactive element on the periodic table, but the calcium fluoride is a beautiful way of getting that fluoride for the enamel of the teeth. We don't need that sodium fluoride that can calcify the pineal gland and calcify every organ, gland, and tissue in the body. So that sodium fluoride will cause the disease that it's meant to prevent. So that's the dizziness of allopathic medicine. So the 3 calciums are beautiful, and magnesium is going to just be magnesium phosphate from the cell salt theory. Now, I also would have included magnesium sulfate. I also would have included magnesium chloride, but in the cell salt theory of Schuessler, he just had the magnesium phosphate. And that's fine, because that's a wonderful remedy. From my perspective, I would like to use 6x magnesium sulfate or magnesium chloride as well, because I find those indispensable remedies. Then we have the iron phosphate, and then we have the standalone energy of silica. So silica is in the carbon family. In carbon, we're carbon based, because carbon can work its valency in its outer shell. It's got the 4 legs for bonding, so it can make single bonds, double bonds, triple bonds, bond to itself. So carbon becomes the brick and mortar, the building block of us. And silica has that carbon energy. It's got that 4 bonding in its outer shell. So it's going to build the connective tissues of the body. So we love silica. So those are the basic 12 salts. And when we look at, the cations and the anions, and so that's the 3-4 harmonics that we're always talking about. And the 12 tissue salts, the 3 and the 4 gives us the 7, God's favorite number. And then the 3 and the 4 also gives us the 12. The 12 signs of the zodiac will bring its energy to influence the 12 meridians. The 12 meridians will light up the 12 cranial nerves. The 12 cranial nerves will influence and light up the 12 organ systems. So I love the 12. Hence, we go to grades 1 through 12, the 12 apostles, the 12 thoracic vertebra, the 12 ribs, the 12 months in a calendar year. So I love using the energy of astrology and numerology as part of my practice. So those are the basic 12 salts that Schuessler set the table for us to use. And if we can really learn these 12 salts, we don't have to study today. Currently, there's probably 4,000 to 5,000 remedies in the Materia Medica. We can just become very proficient with the 12 salts. We can use that again as a standalone. We can use that in combination with homeopathy. We can use that in combination with mineral balancing. So I'm imploring you to really learn these 12 tissue salts because, again, like I previously said, they're indispensable. Now, the key actions of these cell salts, and we're going to go into more detail of each of these 12 salts, but the big picture, so if you don't want to study anymore, you could stop now and just get the basic gist of these 12 salts. But big picture, calcium fluoride, when thinking calcium fluoride, we're thinking bones, we're thinking the enamel of the teeth, and we're thinking the elastic fibers of the body, because this is what gives the suppleness and elasticity and flexibility to the elastic tissues, such as your arteries and veins and any elastic tissue in the body. And so if we're too flexible in our joints and we don't have strength and integrity, we may need calcium fluoride. If we have too many calcium deposits, we may need calcium fluoride to help break up the calcium deposits. Those are the calcium deposits that are in the eyes and the cataracts, the arterial sclerosis, the joint deposition of the calcium deposits, whether in the brain, the heart, the eyes, the joints, the kidney stones, the gallstones. So when we see anyone over 40 and they're prone to calcium deposition disease, we're going to prescribe calcium fluoride. Calcium phosphate is the most abundant cell salt in human physiology. Your bones are mostly calcium phosphate. Your bones is the bone marrow that's going to make your blood cells and your white blood cells. So that's why it's the cell regulator and generator. So this becomes one of the most important remedies in cell salt theory. So I love calcium phosphate. Calcium sulfate, when we see the sulfur component, think sulfur as your sulfation, think liver, think detoxification. And calcium sulfate is a great blood purifier and great cleanser of the skin. So it's going to work the liver, it's going to work the skin. Calcium sulfate is a wonderful remedy. Then we come into the iron phosphate, and I think this remedy is brilliant. It's the oxygenator. It's going to add intelligence to iron metabolism. So if a woman is pregnant, the doctors are always throwing her on iron pills. That's the #1 cause of prenatal jaundice, #1 cause of constipation, #1 cause of a spontaneous miscarriage. So we don't want to give iron pills. What we want to do is give iron phosphate in a 6x homeopathic potency. Now, this will work to oxygenate the body. This will work with iron metabolism. This is a standalone for anyone that has a low-grade fever, 101 or less. You could just not even think, prescribe iron phosphate for those low-grade fevers. We'll go into more detail in iron phosphate. Potassium chloride, Kali Mur, is the convalescent rebuilder. It's working a lot with, as a convalescent, when cells are dying off, they're, producing a lot of mucus discharge. The Potassium Muriaticum helps to clear out that mucus. So it's great for after a fever, after a cold. We're going to have a lot of cell death. This is going to help clear it out so we can heal quicker. Potassium phosphate. This is your homeopathic Valium. This is a nerve nutrient and soother. Most of your brain, all the gray matter in the brain is because of potassium phosphate, Kali Phos. This is great as a nerve tonic. It's a nerve nutrient and soother. Potassium sulfate. This is another oxygen exchanger. So if I see the fever a little bit higher than 101, I'm going to start with the potassium sulfate. But the iron phosphate and the potassium sulfate work beautifully together. We may start with the iron phosphate, come in with the potassium sulfate, a few days later. And so this is also a cell building and oxygen exchanger. And we'll talk more about this as we look at each one of these individually. Mag Phos is another standalone. This is probably one of my all-time favorite cell salts. When you think Mag Phos, think it's your Tylenol, your Midol, your Advil. It's your antispasmodic when we see spasms and twitches, and when a woman's having those uterine contractions from PMS and she's bent over, needs to put the hot water bottle, and she's taking the Midol, but she still has the pain. Mag Phos, you take 10 pellets of the Mag Phos, put it in some warm water, sip that, works better than Midol, and it will help relieve the spasms of the body. So I love the magnesium phosphate. Natrum Mur, remember in the previous video, we were discussing the moon, we were discussing the salt of the moon is sodium. Wherever sodium goes, water goes. Sodium chloride, Natrum Mur, is the fluid regulator of the body. And this will help deal with the fluids of the body. So this is one of the most prescribed homeopathic remedies, because the homeopaths knew with this processed white salt, that umbrella salt, that we would have decades of a sodium toxicity on this planet. And Natrum Mur is probably the most prescribed homeopathic remedy out of the 5,000 remedies in the Materia Medica. It's another indispensable remedy. And Natrum Mur is the fluid regulator of the body. Nat Phos, sodium phosphate, that's the Tums, that's the antacid remedy, that's the acid neutralizer. Beautiful remedy for when we see too much acid in the body, when we see a lot of the candidas and the acids. This is a brilliant remedy, Nat Phos. Nat Sulph is another brilliant remedy. So sulfation, we think liver, we think cleanser, detoxifier, and it's removing the excess fluids in the brain. So when I use Nat Sulph, I'm thinking liver, I'm thinking the brain. And this is one remedy that, never will since a concussion. We can come in with really a higher potency of the Nat Salt and use the tissue salt as a supportive for the biochemical aspect of the cell to get the nutrients into the brain. Love my Nat Salt. Silica, the most abundant element in the Earth's crust. This is again another standalone. It's got that carbon energy. So it's the cell cleanser, it's the tonifier, it's the protector. In homeopathy, we call silica the homeopathic surgeon, because it's helping to remove foreign objects such as splinters or glass or whatever particulate gets into the body, whatever fragments are in us. It helps to remove whatever is foreign in the body. Silica gives us the grit. It's a constituent of all connective tissues. So these are the basic 12 salts that I find if we can master each one of these, We don't have to study the thousands of homeopathic remedies, and we can use these tissue salts. When we see from a mineral balancing perspective, when we see the calcium shell, or we see the 4 low, or we see the sympathetic dominant pattern, we're going to come in with some of the calcium families to add intelligence to calcium metabolism. We can, how do we use these salts? We can use these alone or in combination. So we can come in, with the calcium families, with the previous example of a shell, a 4 low, or a sympathetic dominant pattern. We can come in with just as alone iron phosphate when we see that first signs of the cold flu, with the fever starting to rise, and it's a low-grade fever. We can use the iron phosphate. We can use individually the magnesium phosphate when we see, the period pains or any spasms or cramps or Charlie horses, etc. We can come in with just mag phos, and we can come in with, multiple doses in warm water, and that will help with all those kind of pains and spasms and tics in the body. So you can use these cell salts dry under the tongue or wet in a water potency. We can use combinations. I like to use, the 4 phosphates, the potassium phosphate, the sodium phosphate, the magnesium phosphate, and the calcium phosphate. I like to use those phosphates as a nerve tonic. I put those in the water, shake the water, sip that water throughout the course of the day. That's one way of prescribing. We can use these in agriculture for plants. We can use them for animals, for our dogs, our cats, our horses. We could put it in spray bottles for animals that we can't get too close to. We can use it externally. So when we use these cell salts externally, maybe we want to make a beauty cream. We can take some of the salts, add it to some boiled water, and then you have a teaspoon of the boiled water, add some salts, create a paste, add that paste, whether it's to your toothpaste, whether it's to your beauty creams, whether it's, you're suffering with dandruff, we can add it to our shampoos. So when we do it externally, my only rule of thumb is do not ignore the internal. We want to do it internally as well as externally, and externally can be used for burns, for eczema, psoriasis, so many ways of using it. We can prescribe the cell salts astrologically. We can prescribe the cell salts, based on symptoms, acute symptoms, chronic symptoms. We can use them for all walks of life, animals, plants, humans, babies, etc. Now, dosage is going to be dependent. If it's more acute, you may burn through the remedies a lot quicker, so you may have to repeat the dosage, every 30 minutes or every hour approximately, depending on the severity of the case. More chronic situations, you may use a water potency and sip the water throughout the course of the day. So dosage will vary whether we're dealing with more chronic or an acute situation. But, if we're trying to move, let's say on an iron panel, we get a lab test and our iron or our ferritin or our transferritin or one of the iron markers is off. If we use the iron phosphate for 6 months over time, we can change the lab profile. This is how profound these cell salts really are. So the only limitation is your imagination. You can use these any way you see fit if you have an understanding of the individual cell salt and knowing what it's good for, where it's found in the body, what its main function is. So again, the only limitation is our lack of imagination. Externally, internally, acute, chronic, alone, or in combination. And when I use combinations, I always love to use 3 or 4 salts. That's my 3-4 harmonics. And so I just love these tissue salts, and I find that they really are brilliant in how they can help move the healing needle to a much better place. Again, astrologically, this is beautiful. So, we know that we're baking in our mother's womb for 9 months. So when we're born, I was born in Capricorn. So I'm going to be deficient in calcium phosphate, sodium chloride, and ferrum phos. So if I could start the case just based on this alone. And so this isn't the only way to prescribe it. In fact, it's a small part of how I prescribe it, but it certainly is one way. So just because I'm born in Capricorn doesn't mean I may need my polar opposite in Cancer, calcium fluoride, or the Cancer may need its polar opposite, calcium phosphate. We know Aries is the head. That's where the cycle should begin in the spring, the beginning of the season. And we know that potassium phosphate nourishes the brain, the gray matter of the brain. So this is a great tonic for overstimulation, for brain fog, for just we're not firing on all cylinders. Our brain isn't where it should be. What an amazing tonic, potassium sulfate. Potassium phosphate, excuse me. Potassium phosphate is great as a brain tonic. Sodium sulfate, the taurines, if you were born in Taurus, this is another one for more the cerebellum part, the face, kind of the whole head and face, neck area is this sodium sulfate. But anyone that has a history of never well since a concussion, you will prescribe sodium sulfate. Gemini, the twins, the two lungs, the two arms, the bronchial tree. So this is a great remedy when we're dealing with a lot of children, when they go into that Mercury cycle, because Gemini is ruled by Mercury. And that's when we start to get a lot of throat infections, sinus infections, air infections, blocked eustachian tubes, potassium chloride. Calcium, Cancer is calcium fluoride. And another amazing remedy to support the connective tissues, the elastic fibers, from the ligaments, the tendons, to the arteries, the veins. That calcium fluoride is beautiful. Now the sun, of course, Leo is the heart. So the mineral most required in the body is the heart. That's the ATP generation, that magnesium. So we know that magnesium is the magnetic energy of the sun. Where the sun, we have the three phases of the sun: the sunrise, the midday sun, and the sunset. And so we're going to have three basic metals of the sun, where the masculine energy of the sun is gold, the neutral energy of the sun is hydrogen, and the feminine energy of the sun that sets the table for all life on planet Earth is magnesium. Magnesium is the magnetic, majestic, magical, Magdalene energy that bursts life on planet Earth. So that's why it is the sun. No coincidence that magnesium on the table of elements is number 12 on your periodic table of elements. So we see that magnesium is number 12. It is the sun. The sun has to go through the 12 houses on the zodiac. Whoops, went the wrong way, excuse me. Okay, lost my place. Oh, I'm sorry. Give me a second. We'll restore this. Okay, so we're talking about how we can use these cell salts from an astrological perspective, from an acute perspective, from a chronic perspective, from a mineral balancing perspective, from a organ support perspective. So there is no limitation on how we can use these salts. Now, Libra is the balance. Okay, so sodium phosphate, Nat Phos, deals with the acids of the body. So in the scales of Libra, we don't want to be too acidic or too alkaline, and sodium phosphate is the alkaline, is the acid balancer of the body. Scorpio is calcium sulfate, Sagittarius is silica, Capricorn is calcium phosphate. We know Capricorn rules the bones. The most abundant element in the bones is calcium phosphate, and this is a wonderful bone nutrient remedy. Aquarius is sodium chloride, and Pisces is iron phosphate. So those are the 12 salts that we can use from an astrological perspective. And now we're going to get into the individual metals. So I'm going to take a time out and we're going to go through each of the 12 salts individually.